Camille Carter, a confident and accomplished black woman, strode into Pearson International Airport with the grace and poise of someone who had spent years navigating high-pressure environments. Her tailored black suit was impeccable, and her gleaming silver hair reflected the airport's fluorescent lights, exuding sophistication. Her most notable accessory, however, was a gleaming metal suitcase that she carried effortlessly, a suitcase that would soon become the subject of unwarranted suspicion and scrutiny. Camille was en route to Washington, D.C., to receive the Presidential Medal of Freedom, a prestigious award recognizing her invaluable contributions to national security. The airport was bustling with activity, filled with the chatter of travelers and the sound of rolling suitcases. Camille's composed demeanor drew attention, but not all of it was welcoming. She was used to the glances, the curiosity her presence often inspired, but she paid no mind as she made her way to the security checkpoint. Sarah Johnson, a seasoned security officer, stood at the checkpoint with a keen eye for detail. Having encountered several troubling incidents in her past, Sarah had developed an overly cautious approach to her job. When Camille approached, Sarah's gaze locked onto the metal suitcase, an unusual item that immediately sparked suspicion. Camille's documents were in perfect order, and her behavior was calm and respectful, but Sarah couldn't shake her unease. The suitcase's metallic gleam seemed to taunt her, stirring memories of past mistakes and near misses. Without any concrete evidence, Sarah decided to act on her instincts, radioing the security team to express her concerns. Camille noticed the subtle shift in Sarah's demeanor but chose not to react. She had encountered similar scrutiny countless times before and had learned to maintain her composure in such situations. With practiced grace, she continued toward the boarding gate, her footsteps echoing softly on the tiled floor. However, an undercurrent of tension was quietly taking shape. Sarah's suspicion had sown a seed of doubt that would soon grow into something far more troubling. As Camille approached the boarding gate, she scanned the crowd with a discerning eye, taking note of her surroundings. Years of experience in intelligence work had honed her ability to read people and situations. She could feel the weight of judgment from certain individuals, but she maintained her calm exterior, refusing to let prejudice dictate her actions. Once on board the plane, Camille placed her suitcase in the overhead compartment with care, her movements precise and deliberate. The first-class cabin was a haven of luxury, with plush leather seats and soft lighting creating an atmosphere of tranquility. Camille settled into her seat, opening a small notebook to jot down thoughts for her upcoming speech. Despite the serene surroundings, she remained alert, aware of the eyes that lingered on her, especially those of Diane Miller, the lead flight attendant. Diane had a reputation for being diligent and professional, but recent experiences had left her overly vigilant. As she moved through the cabin, her gaze repeatedly returned to Camille and the metal suitcase. Something about Camille's demeanor unsettled her. She didn't fit the mold of the typical first-class passenger, and her polished exterior seemed almost too perfect, too calculated. Unable to suppress her curiosity, Diane approached Camille with a polite smile. "Do you need any assistance?" she asked. Camille looked up from her notebook, her calm eyes meeting Diane's. "No, thank you," she replied softly, her tone polite but firm. Diane returned to the back of the cabin, her mind racing with thoughts. She shared her concerns with Evan Smith, a younger colleague known for his level-headedness. "She's different," Diane whispered. "And that suitcase, did you see it?" Evan raised an eyebrow, a skeptical smile playing on his lips. "First-class passengers bring all sorts of things. It's probably just work equipment. Let's not jump to conclusions." But Diane couldn't let it go. Her mind was filled with memories of past flights, incidents where seemingly harmless passengers had turned out to be carrying dangerous items. The fear of making a mistake, of overlooking something important, gnawed at her. She resolved to keep a closer eye on Camille, each glance feeding her growing suspicion. Camille, meanwhile, remained focused on her notebook, her expression serene. But she was acutely aware of the scrutiny. Her years in intelligence had taught her to recognize even the subtlest signs of distrust. Though she remained silent, a sense of unease began to take root. She knew that prejudice often disguised itself as caution and that her calm exterior was likely being misinterpreted as secrecy. The tension in the cabin grew, unspoken but palpable. Diane's unease spread to other crew members, creating an atmosphere of quiet discomfort. Diane decided she needed to take further action. She approached the cockpit, knocking gently before entering. Captain David Williams, a seasoned pilot, looked up from the controls, his expression curious but composed. "Captain," Diane began, her tone serious, "I think we have an issue. The woman in seat 2A is carrying a very unusual metal suitcase. I've spoken to her, but her responses made me suspicious. I think we should report this." Captain Williams frowned, listening carefully. "We can't report a passenger based solely on personal feelings," he said firmly. "Do you have any concrete evidence that she poses a threat?" Diane hesitated. "No, but she's too calm. The way she's guarding that suitcase, it feels off. I've seen situations like this before. I don't want to take any chances." Captain Williams leaned back in his seat, considering her words. "We have protocols in place for a reason. If you're that concerned, we can notify security upon landing. But until then, we must treat her with the same respect as any other passenger." Diane nodded reluctantly, but the nagging doubt remained. She returned to the cabin, her gaze once again lingering on Camille. Each interaction, each glance, only deepened her conviction that something was amiss. Camille, fully aware of the scrutiny, maintained her calm facade. She knew that any reaction could escalate the situation. Instead, she focused on her notes, preparing for the important event awaiting her in Washington. The notebook in her hands contained not just her speech but also years of insights and strategies that had earned her the prestigious award she was about to receive. As the flight continued, the atmosphere remained tense. Passengers exchanged whispers, sensing the unease among the crew. Diane's growing suspicion, fueled by her own insecurities and past experiences, began to overshadow her professionalism. The line between caution and prejudice blurred, leading her to make decisions that would have lasting consequences. Diane's mind was in turmoil as she left the cockpit. Captain Williams's casual dismissal of her concerns lingered in her thoughts, like a nagging itch she couldn't scratch. The words, "let everything proceed as normal," echoed in her head, but she couldn't shake the unease settling in her chest. Something about Camille and her suitcase felt off, even though logic told her there was no reason for suspicion. Yet, logic had taken a back seat, replaced by an inexplicable sense of dread. She returned to the cabin, her eyes scanning for Camille. Her gaze locked onto the sleek, gleaming metal suitcase stored in the overhead compartment. Each time she passed by, the suitcase seemed to catch the light in a way that made her heart race. It was as though the object itself was mocking her growing paranoia. Diane knew she should let it go, but the seed of suspicion had taken root, spreading like ivy through her thoughts. Her tension wasn't just about Camille or the suitcase anymore. It was about herself. Deep down, Diane sensed that her anxiety stemmed from something more personal, something uncomfortable to confront. At that moment, she didn't realize that her own prejudices and assumptions were steadily becoming the catalyst for a series of unforeseen events. As the plane neared its destination, Diane's determination hardened. Despite Captain Williams's refusal to act, she couldn't ignore the nagging voice in her head. Her colleague, Evan, tried to dissuade her. "Diane, come on. Let it go. You're overthinking this." "I can't," she whispered back. "I'm going to speak with airport security as soon as we land." Evan sighed but said nothing more. Diane's resolve was unshakable. As the plane touched down smoothly at Washington Dulles Airport, the tension in the cabin was palpable. Passengers murmured among themselves, exchanging curious glances. Something was clearly happening, and they could sense it. Captain Williams's voice crackled over the intercom, calm but firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, for security purposes, we ask all passengers to remain seated after landing. A minor issue needs to be resolved before disembarkation. Thank you for your cooperation." The announcement sent ripples of unease through the cabin. Whispers intensified. Passengers craned their necks, trying to catch a glimpse of any unusual activity. Camille, seated in 2A, remained composed. Her demeanor was calm, but her instincts told her that she was at the center of this brewing storm. She had felt the weight of Diane's gaze throughout the flight. It wasn't unfamiliar. That subtle, scrutinizing look she had encountered countless times before. It was the look of someone trying to piece together a narrative based on assumptions. Heavy footsteps echoed from the back of the plane. A group of uniformed police officers boarded, their presence commanding immediate attention. One officer, his voice authoritative, called out, Passenger in seat 2A, please stand up and follow us. We need to inspect your luggage. The cabin fell into a tense silence. All eyes turned to Camille as she gracefully rose from her seat. Her composed gaze swept across the cabin, meeting the curious, anxious stares of other passengers. She noticed the whispers, the barely concealed assumptions. Something's up with her, a man murmured. She looks unusual. Camille took a deep breath, steadying herself. She reached up to the overhead compartment and calmly retrieved her suitcase. Her movements were deliberate, unhurried. There was no sign of panic or distress. She followed the officers without protest, her demeanor unshaken. In a sterile inspection room at the airport, Camille placed the suitcase on a metal table. The harsh neon lights cast sharp shadows, heightening the room's cold, clinical atmosphere. Diane stood silently in the corner, her palms clammy with sweat. Her heart pounded as she watched the officers prepare to inspect the suitcase. This was it. This was the moment her suspicions would be confirmed, or shattered. Please open the suitcase, ma'am, one officer requested. His voice was devoid of emotion, professional yet distant. Camille nodded calmly. She keyed in the lock combination with practiced ease. The suitcase clicked open, the lid lifting to reveal a luxurious red velvet lining. Nestled inside was a gleaming medal, the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Beside it lay an official certificate, bearing the seal and signature of the President of the United States. The officers froze, stunned into silence. Their eyes widened as they took in the significance of what they were seeing. One officer, barely able to contain his shock, muttered, "Is this real?" Camille's voice, calm yet resolute, cut through the tension. "Yes. This is the Presidential Medal of Freedom. I received it yesterday for my contributions to national security. And now, I would like to know why I've been treated as a threat." Diane's face drained of color. Her gaze remained fixated on the medal, unable to reconcile the image before her with the narrative she had constructed in her mind. She felt the weight of her assumptions crashing down around her, each one more damning than the last. An officer, his face flushed with embarrassment, stepped forward to address Camille. "We deeply apologize for this inconvenience. We were simply following procedure." Camille's eyes narrowed. "No, you weren't simply following procedure. You acted on prejudice. Because of that, you didn't just humiliate me in front of a plane full of passengers, you disrupted my work and my dignity. I hope you understand the gravity of your actions." Diane's head bowed lower with each word. The realization of her mistake hit her like a freight train. Her actions hadn't been driven by logic or evidence but by biases she hadn't even acknowledged until now. She knew that no simple apology would suffice. The room remained silent, the atmosphere heavy with tension and regret. Camille stood tall, her posture unwavering. Her gaze locked onto the nearest officer, who still looked visibly unsettled by the unfolding events. "You've inspected my suitcase," Camille began, her voice low but commanding. "Now, I want to hear the real reason why I was brought here and humiliated in front of dozens of passengers." Diane pressed herself into the corner of the room, her body rigid with shame. Camille's gaze swept over her, not with anger but with a sharpness that cut through any defense Diane might have had. The silence stretched, uncomfortable and unyielding. Finally, one officer hesitated before speaking. "We were following a report from the crew, we didn't mean to." Camille raised her hand, cutting him off. "No. Don't blame protocol. This isn't about the suitcase or what I might have been carrying. This is about me. Because of who I am." Her words hung in the air, resonating deeply. Diane swallowed hard, feeling sweat trickle down her back. She knew Camille was right. From the moment Camille had boarded the plane, Diane's thoughts had been clouded by assumptions she now couldn't bear to admit. Camille turned her attention directly to Diane. Her voice, steady but chilling, pierced through the silence. "Do you know what it feels like to be scrutinized simply because of your appearance? Have you ever considered that your actions, your stares, your whispers, and your baseless report could harm someone?" Diane froze, her eyes darting with confusion and regret. She couldn't find the words to respond. Camille's questions weren't rhetorical. They were a mirror reflecting Diane's own biases back at her. Camille's voice softened slightly, though the intensity remained. "You thought I was unusual, didn't you? Because I didn't fit the image of the first-class passengers you're used to seeing." But you never stopped to ask yourself if maybe I was there because I earned it. Diane bit her lip, her hands clenched tightly at her sides. She dared not deny it, knowing it would only make things worse. At that moment, she realized there was no hiding from the truth of her actions. As though all her justifications had become meaningless, the biases Diane had avoided confronting were now laid bare before her. Every mental shield she had erected to defend her actions crumbled. She stood in the room, feeling the weight of the silence pressing down on her. Apologies formed on her lips, but the realization hit her hard. Words alone would never suffice. Camille took a deep breath, her gaze softening slightly, though her tone remained firm and resolute. An apology is a first step, she said, her voice measured, but the next step is for you to change. Not just for yourself, but for others too. Are you willing to do that? Diane nodded slowly, her eyes reflecting genuine remorse. But Camille knew that time would tell whether those feelings would translate into real action. Change wasn't something that happened overnight, nor was it something people could be coerced into with a single conversation. It had to be internal, deliberate, and sustained. Camille watched Diane carefully for a moment longer before turning and stepping out of the security room. The radiant afternoon light at Washington Dulles Airport greeted Camille as she exited. The golden glow bathed the terminal in warmth, yet Camille hardly noticed. Outwardly composed, a storm of emotions swirled within her: exhaustion, disappointment, and resolve, all intertwining. As she made her way through the airport, her posture remained upright and dignified, but each step felt heavier than the last. A black car awaited her outside, its sleek frame reflecting the afternoon sunlight. Camille slipped into the back seat, the familiar interior offering a momentary sense of comfort. The driver nodded at her in the rearview mirror before pulling away from the curb, merging into the flow of traffic that snaked its way toward Washington, D.C. The streets of the city were bathed in the golden light of sunset, casting long shadows on the sidewalks. But Camille barely noticed the beauty around her. Her mind replayed the events at the airport on an endless loop. Diane's gaze, the office's words, the whispered assumptions of passengers, all of it weighed on her like a burden she couldn't put down. When the car finally pulled up to her home, Camille stepped out and made her way to the front door. Her house, with its neatly kept exterior and familiar scents, had always been a sanctuary for her after long, stressful days. But today, even that familiar comfort couldn't completely dispel the weight pressing down on her chest. Inside, the scent of lavender lingered in the air, courtesy of a candle burning on the kitchen counter. Camille inhaled deeply, letting the soothing aroma ease some of her tension. She placed the metal suitcase carefully on the desk in her study and opened it, her eyes resting on the object inside. The Presidential Medal of Freedom sat nestled in a bed of red velvet. Its polished surface gleamed under the light of the desk lamp, casting tiny reflections across the room. Camille stared at it for a long moment, her thoughts drifting to the significance of the medal, a symbol of recognition for her contributions to national security. Yet, in that moment, it felt like both a badge of honor and a stark reminder of how far society still had to go. Her phone buzzed, pulling her out of her reverie. Camille glanced at the screen and saw the name of an old friend and mentor, James Preston. Taking a deep breath, she answered the call. Camille, James's warm, steady voice came through the line. I just heard about what happened at the airport. Are you okay? Camille leaned back in her leather chair, gazing out the window. I'm fine, James. But this can't just pass quietly. It's not just about me. This is something that many others are facing, too. James paused for a moment before responding. You're right. This isn't personal. It's systemic. And if anyone can spark change, it's you. Turn your outrage into action. Let this be a beginning, not an end. James's words stirred something within Camille. After ending the call, she opened her laptop and began to write. Her fingers moved swiftly across the keyboard as she recounted the events at the airport, but she didn't stop there. She delved deeper, exploring the systemic issues that allowed such incidents to occur, from the biases passengers faced to the gaps in the training of airline staff. Each paragraph became a precise critique, exposing the flaws that had led to the incident she endured. Camille outlined concrete solutions, knowing that change wouldn't come from vague promises but from actionable steps. First, she emphasized the importance of mandatory training on unconscious bias. Employees needed to not only recognize their biases but also actively address and eliminate them. Second, she called for clear and transparent procedures for security-related decisions. No one should be subjected to scrutiny based solely on personal intuition or prejudice. Lastly, she stressed the need for enhanced accountability. Incidents like hers had to be thoroughly investigated, and those responsible for discriminatory behavior had to face appropriate consequences. Camille worked late into the night, her determination fueling every word she wrote. When she finally finished, she read the report back to herself. A small but profound sense of relief washed over her. This wasn't just her voice, it was a voice for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly. The next morning, Camille walked into the headquarters of Global Wings Airlines, a towering building in downtown Washington, D.C. Its modern glass facade gleamed in the sunlight, a symbol of the airline's power and pride. But Camille wasn't there to admire its polished exterior. She entered with a single goal in mind: to demand justice. The conference room was on the top floor, offering a sweeping view of the city below. Michael Harrison, the CEO of Global Wings, stood to greet her as she entered. A middle-aged man with a well-groomed appearance, Harrison extended a hand in polite greeting. "Miss Carter," he began. "Thank you for taking the time to meet with us. First, let me express my deepest regret for what happened on our flight. This is not how Global Wings operates, and we sincerely apologize if you felt hurt." Camille observed him quietly for a moment, letting his words hang in the air. Then she spoke, her tone calm but commanding. "Your apology sounds sincere, but it doesn't address the problem. This isn't about me feeling hurt. This is a systemic issue. What happened on that flight is a clear example of how unconscious bias has become embedded in your airline's operations." Harrison's polite smile faltered slightly, and Camille noticed the defensiveness creeping into his expression. "Miss Carter, I understand your frustration. We are thoroughly reviewing the incident and will implement measures to prevent such occurrences in the future. However, I assure you, this was an isolated case." Camille leaned forward, her gaze unwavering. "Isolated? Do you truly believe this was a one-off incident? Or are you saying that to minimize responsibility?" Harrison's expression grew more serious. "We take all reports seriously, and..." Camille cut him off. "Passengers like me aren't treated this way by coincidence. It's the result of a culture that lacks awareness and accountability." Harrison shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. "Miss Carter, we will consider your concerns and take appropriate action." Camille reached into her bag, pulling out the report she had prepared. She placed it on the table and slid it toward Harrison. "This isn't just about consideration. It's about concrete steps. Here are my proposals." Harrison opened the report, scanning the pages. His expression grew more serious with each paragraph he read. "You can choose to ignore this," Camille said, her tone unwavering. "But if you do, I will ensure this story is shared far and wide. I have a platform, and I will use it to demand justice. Not just for myself, but for everyone your airline has wronged." Overnight, Camille leaned back in her chair, her gaze still piercing. "Change is never easy, Mr. Harrison, but if you don't act now, the cost will be far greater later." The meeting ended in a tense atmosphere, but it was clear Camille had left a lasting impact. As she walked out of the building, she knew this was only the beginning. The fight to change a system deeply rooted in prejudice would not be easy, but Camille had no intention of backing down. Camille stepped out of the Global Wings headquarters with resolute steps. Although the meeting with CEO Harrison hadn't yielded immediate commitments, she knew she had planted the seeds of change. But she also understood that a much larger battle awaited, one that went beyond a single airline, reaching across the entire nation. A few days later, Camille received a call from the office of Senator Michael Hargrave, a prominent politician known for his unwavering dedication to protecting the rights of citizens. Hargrave was in the process of drafting a bill titled the Passenger Dignity Act, aimed at reforming the airline industry to eliminate bias and ensure fair treatment of all passengers. When Camille entered Hargrave's office on Capitol Hill, she was struck by the space's commanding presence, adorned with historical photographs and important documents. The senator, a middle-aged man with silver hair and a decisive demeanor, greeted her warmly with a firm handshake. "Miss Carter," Hargrave began, his voice deep and inspiring, "I've heard about what happened to you. What you experienced wasn't just a personal affront, it's a dark reminder that we must do more to build a fairer system. Your story is a powerful testament to why this bill needs to pass. Camille nodded, her eyes reflecting her determination. Thank you, Senator. I'm ready to do whatever it takes to ensure no one else has to endure what I did. Hargrave smiled, as though he'd found the perfect ally. I'd like you to testify at the upcoming hearing. Your story has the power to sway those who remain undecided. On the day of the hearing, Camille entered the congressional hearing room carrying her familiar metal suitcase. The room was packed with people, from senators and reporters to representatives from the airline industry. The atmosphere was tense, yet filled with anticipation. Camera flashes lit up as Camille made her way to the witness stand, all eyes following her every move. Senator Hargrave opened the hearing with a powerful speech. Today, we're not just discussing a piece of legislation, we're discussing dignity, how we treat one another on flights, where the trust and safety of passengers are placed in the hands of airlines. But what happens when that trust is betrayed by bias? Then it was Camille's turn. She stood, her gaze sweeping across the room before she began speaking. Her voice was strong, carrying a blend of resolve and emotion. Honorable Senators, I stand before you today not just as a passenger, but as a representative for all those who have been unfairly treated for reasons beyond their control, their skin color, gender, or appearance. She recounted the incident on the flight in vivid detail, from Diane's scrutinizing gaze to the silent judgment of other passengers to the moment the suitcase was opened. She paused, allowing her words to sink into the minds of those listening. This isn't just my story, she continued, her voice catching slightly. This is the story of thousands who have been misjudged simply because they didn't fit a mold. And if we don't act, these stories will continue. The room fell silent. No one dared to speak. Camille looked directly at the senators, finishing with a powerful plea. We have an opportunity to create change, not just in a system, but in how we see and treat one another. Don't let this opportunity slip away. As Camille sat down, the room remained hushed. Then a single clap broke the silence, followed by a growing wave of applause. Reporters scribbled furiously, and the atmosphere in the room seemed to shift. Camille's story hadn't just moved emotions, it had ignited a collective resolve to act. After the hearing concluded, Senator Hargrave approached Camille, shaking her hand with a look of deep appreciation in his eyes. You did incredibly well, Miss Carter. You didn't just speak the truth, you inspired us. This is the start of something significant. Camille smiled, but she knew this was only the first step. A long battle lay ahead, but today she had set a pivotal change in motion. The congressional hearing had unleashed a wave of strong public reactions. Major television networks replayed Camille's emotional testimony, and social media platforms were flooded with posts, videos, and comments about her story. However, as with any high-profile issue, not everyone was supportive. Alongside the praise for Camille's courage, some social media users began to criticize her. Many posts carried a skeptical tone, suggesting that Camille was blowing the incident out of proportion for attention. One person wrote, "She's just a passenger like anyone else. The airline was just doing its security duty. Why is she making such a big deal out of it?" Another, harsher tweet read, "This was just a minor incident. Why turn it into a national issue? Seems like she's trying to profit off the attention." Such comments didn't surprise Camille. She was all too familiar with being misunderstood and misjudged. But that didn't make them any less disheartening. Sitting in her tidy home office, she read through the responses on her laptop, both positive and negative. Every piece of criticism served as a reminder of the biases she was working so hard to challenge. However, interspersed among the critiques were countless messages of support. Many people shared similar stories of being treated unfairly while traveling. One woman wrote, "I was once asked to have my luggage thoroughly searched just because I didn't look like a first-class passenger. Thank you, Camille Carter, for speaking the truth for all of us." Camille took a deep breath, drawing strength from the support of those she was representing. Yet she knew she couldn't shift public opinion alone. Something more significant needed to happen, a stronger catalyst for change. One morning, Camille received a notification in her email inbox. The subject line was simple: "You might want to see this article." Attached was a link to a social media post by a passenger who had been on the same fateful flight. The post began with an introduction. I was one of the passengers on that flight. I witnessed everything, and it's time I spoke up. The author, a young entrepreneur named Marcus Allen, recounted the incident in detail. He described how Diane had been watching Camille from the moment she boarded, how her eyes never left the suitcase, and the unnecessary tension she created. Camille Carter did nothing wrong, the Post read. It's disgraceful that a passenger as respectable as her was treated this way simply because of bias. I was there, and I can confirm this was not a security issue. This was about prejudice. The Post quickly went viral, garnering thousands of likes and shares. Supportive comments for Camille surged, and her story once again became a central topic of discussion. One person wrote, "It's great to have a witness speak out. This only proves that Camille Carter was right." Marcus Allen's account not only increased public pressure but also put Global Wings Airlines in a tougher position. Journalists began demanding specific responses from the airline instead of the vague apologies they had previously offered. Diane Miller, who had remained silent since the incident, found her name prominently mentioned in media reports. Reading Marcus's post and the positive reactions it sparked, Camille felt as though she was no longer fighting this battle alone. She sent a message to Marcus. "Your words carry more power than you realize. Thank you for standing up for justice." Camille's story had now grown beyond her personal experience. It had become a symbol of a broader struggle, far exceeding a single flight. She understood that all eyes were now on her, and she was determined not to let anyone down. The fight continued, and she was ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. Doubt her not because of her actions but because she doesn't look like what you're used to. What do you think? What do you do? The words hit Diane like a jolt. She vividly recalled each moment on the flight. Her scrutinizing gaze, her whispers to a colleague, and her decision to report Camille. Sitting there now, she realized her actions weren't just mistakes, they were rooted in biases she had never confronted. By the end of the training, Diane left the room with a profound sense of remorse and determination. She knew she couldn't change the past, but she could learn from it. As Global Wings took its first steps toward improving corporate culture, not all airlines embraced such changes. Some industry leaders, particularly from smaller carriers, began to push back against the proposed Passenger Dignity Act. In a closed-door meeting with lawmakers and airline representatives, an executive from a major regional airline voiced his concerns. "We're not against fairness, but let's be realistic. These training programs and oversight measures will cost millions. That's going to drive up ticket prices and strain airlines already under competitive pressure." Senator Michael Hargrave, leading the charge for the bill's passage, barely concealed his frustration. "So you're suggesting we maintain a system where passengers are mistreated because you're worried about expenses? Fairness isn't something we uphold only when it's convenient." Camille, seated beside Hargrave, listened intently to the debate. When asked for her opinion, she stood, her voice measured but powerful. "What we're discussing isn't just about costs, it's about dignity and responsibility. If we value profits over fairness, we fail in our role as leaders. And if the airline industry doesn't change, passengers like me and thousands of others will continue to suffer." Her statement left the room silent for a few moments. But the quiet didn't last long. Some leaders persisted in their opposition, arguing that the proposed reforms were impractical. Hargrave and Camille both knew the fight ahead would be long and fraught with challenges. Despite the resistance, their efforts began to bear fruit. Under increasing public pressure, several other airlines announced plans to implement reforms similar to those of Global Wings. Yet Camille understood this was only the beginning. Real change required more than promises, it demanded concrete and lasting action. Meanwhile, Diane started taking small but meaningful steps to atone for her mistakes. She didn't just participate in training sessions, she also began sharing her story with colleagues as a reminder of how bias not only causes harm but also undermines trust and fairness in their work. From a distance, Camille observed these changes and felt a glimmer of hope. But she knew that fulfilling her mission would require continued effort, not just within the airline industry, but also against the entrenched attitudes that stood in the way of progress. After months of reform and effort, the aviation industry began to see positive changes. Major airlines hosted workshops to raise awareness about unconscious bias, involving employees, leadership, and experts. One of the most significant events was the National Conference on Equity and Respect in Air Travel, where Camille Carter was invited as the keynote speaker. The conference took place in a grand auditorium under dazzling lights, with hundreds of attendees closely following the presentations. Camille, exuding confidence and speaking with a calm yet commanding tone, captivated the audience as she shared her story and emphasized the importance of fair treatment. Following Camille's presentation, the event's moderator made an unexpected announcement. "We have someone who would like to share a few words, a flight crew member who has personally experienced and learned from one of the situations we're discussing today. Please welcome Diane Miller." The room fell silent. Diane stepped onto the stage, her face a mix of tension and resolve. Under the bright lights, she looked out at the audience before turning to Camille, seated nearby. Taking a deep breath, Diane began to speak. "First, I want to thank this conference for allowing me to speak," Diane said, her voice trembling slightly but filled with sincerity. "I'm here today not to make excuses but to acknowledge my mistakes." She paused, her gaze fixed on Camille. "Miss Carter, I want to offer you a public apology. On that flight, I allowed unconscious biases to dictate my actions. I doubted you not because of anything you did wrong, but because I failed to overcome the stereotypes that society has ingrained in me. I was wrong, and I know this apology cannot undo what happened. But I hope it can be a step toward making things right." Diane continued, her voice growing steadier as she shared her journey since the incident. "Through the training sessions, I've learned that bias doesn't just harm others, it diminishes our humanity. I've come to understand that fairness isn't an abstract concept, but a daily responsibility we all share. And I am committed to upholding it." The room remained silent, the audience absorbing the authenticity of Diane's words. Camille stood, walked onto the stage, and faced Diane. At that moment, their eyes met, not with judgment or tension, but with mutual understanding. "Diane," Camille began, her voice calm yet filled with emotion. "I accept your apology. But remember, what matters most is not just words but the actions we take from here onward. I hope you will continue to use this lesson to create change, not just for yourself, but for those around you." Camille turned to the audience, her voice resonating strong and clear. "We cannot change the past, but we can learn from it to build a better future. This fight is not just mine or Diane's, it's ours. And if we truly commit, we can create the change the world needs." Applause erupted, hesitant at first, then growing into a standing ovation that filled the auditorium. Diane stepped off the stage, her face reflecting a mix of relief and determination. She knew that this public apology wasn't an ending, it was the beginning of a long journey. As the conference concluded, Camille left the auditorium with a sense of lightness. Diane had begun her path toward redemption, and Camille hoped she would not only transform herself but also serve as an example for others. For Camille, this wasn't a moment of personal victory, but a reminder that the work was far from over. Change doesn't come from a single event or a lone speech, it comes from the persistent effort of every individual. And Camille, as always, was ready to continue the journey. A crisp autumn morning bathed the windows of the Capitol building in gentle sunlight. Camille Carter sat in the guest section, her gaze steady as she watched the packed hearing room. All eyes were on the screen displaying the vote count. This was a pivotal day, the day that would determine the future of the Passenger Dignity Act, the culmination of months of tireless efforts by Camille, Senator Hargrave, and countless advocates for justice. When the final vote tally appeared, the room erupted into applause. The Passenger Dignity Act was passed with an overwhelming majority. Camille closed her eyes for a moment, letting the sense of relief wash over her. This wasn't just her victory, it was a triumph for everyone who had ever suffered from bias and injustice. Senator Hargrave approached her, a radiant smile lighting up his face. "We did it, Miss Carter," he said, his eyes gleaming with pride. Camille nodded, her voice calm yet filled with emotion. "This is just the beginning. The real work starts now, ensuring that what we've achieved is implemented properly." A few days later, Camille received a handwritten letter from a woman she had never met. The simple, heartfelt script carried immense emotion. "Dear Miss Carter, I want to extend my deepest thanks to you. Last year, my son, just 10 years old, was treated unfairly at an airport security checkpoint. I didn't know what to do but remained silent and endured. But when I saw you stand up and speak the truth, I felt like I too had a voice. Yesterday, when I told my son that the bill had passed, he smiled and said, "Now they won't look down on us anymore. Thank you for standing not only for yourself but for all of us." As Camille finished reading, a wave of emotion surged through her. She placed the letter on her desk, her gaze resting on the familiar metal suitcase, a symbol of her long, arduous journey. At this moment, more than any other, she was reminded of the profound importance of continuing the fight. Weeks later, Camille prepared to board another flight, this time as an advisor to the newly formed Aviation Equity Commission. At the boarding gate, she noticed a young boy and his mother, perhaps the ones who had written the letter. The boy turned to Camille, his eyes lighting up in recognition. Camille knelt slightly, smiled, and said, "You are the reason I keep doing this." She boarded the plane, the soft light streaming through the window casting a glow over her resolute face. Camille took her seat and gazed out at the clear blue sky ahead. She knew this journey had no end. There was still much work to be done, countless voices waiting to be heard, and many changes yet to be made. But she also knew that with every small step forward, a fairer future was coming into view. And Camille Carter, with unshakable determination, was ready to continue her journey, for justice, for dignity, and for all those looking to her for hope. As the plane ascended into the vast sky, it symbolized hope and the limitless possibilities that lay ahead. Camille Carter's story is not just one of personal triumph, but a beacon of courage and perseverance in the fight for justice.